Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by Mr. Paul Keels, the voice of the Ohio State Buckeyes since 1998. He's also an alum of Xavier. He's had many different stops over his illustrious broadcasting career. Paul, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Glad to do it, Billy.
Well, I want to start off with first, how have you been handling this pandemic? I mean, this is something that has impacted our lives both professionally and personally the last year. So how have you been handling this past year?
Well, it's been a challenge, just like it has been for everybody. The the Monday through Friday work I do for our radio station in Columbus, a majority of that I've done from home. As far as football and basketball games, like most people, away games we had to do remotely. The only game away from Columbus that we did get a chance to do was the NCAA tournament game for Ohio State in Indianapolis, and unfortunately, that wasn't a short stay. Doing games remotely is a challenge, especially for football with the width of the field and even with basketball, different type of challenges. But, we understood why our company made a decision for health and safety reasons for no business travel, not just for us, but for all employees across our company. So it's been a challenge, but, we've done the best we could to make everything work as best as we could.
And I was wondering, I was looking at your career, and you've called games at some iconic places. I mean, the Pistons, Michigan, and Cincinnati. I was wondering, how have each of these places impacted your career and really prepared you for your job at Ohio State?
Well, they've all had an impact one way or another, Billy. Cincinnati is my hometown, first off, so I got started there and then was able to return there and began as a news reporter at WLW in Cincinnati. Then the opportunity came to go to Detroit and work at WJR, where I did Pistons games for 1 year, and then switched stations and went to an all-news radio station, WWJ, which was a CBS station, and for 6 years did the University of Michigan. And I was very young. I was in my 20s at that point. But having the opportunity to work in a major market and work with some incredibly talented news journalists who had been in the business for a long time really taught me a lot of things. I learned a lot of things, both in a good way and a bad way. Went through a change of ownership in the late 1980s where I ended up being out of work because of that. A number of us were let go from our station after a change of ownership, and then had to go through the whole process of scrambling to find another job, briefly back in Cincinnati, in Washington, D.C. at United Press International. Got back to Cincinnati, worked in Dayton, and then eventually ended up in Columbus. So it's kind of taken me all over the place. But maybe the most significant thing about all those stops, Billy, is the people you meet. Being able to make contacts, make friendships. The job I got in Columbus was as a result of a relationship that I had in my first year in the business in Cincinnati through an acquaintance who then was involved in hiring me in 1998 in Columbus. So that's been probably the greatest part about all the people that you get to meet and come across.
That's great to hear. And I was wondering, how did this opportunity open up in Columbus over 20 years ago?
Well, I was working in Cincinnati doing games for the University of Cincinnati. And the people at WBNS Radio in Columbus, who were the rights holders and still are for Ohio State broadcast, were contemplating making a change in their announcing position. And the executive producer, a gentleman by the name of Ed Douglas, who I'd known from back in the late 1970s, reached out to gauge my interest. And one thing led to another. And the next thing you know, I was making the decision to move 2 hours up the road to Columbus.
Well, that's great to hear. And I was wondering, what are some of your favorite memories behind the mic for the Ohio State Buckeyes? I mean, I think about the 2002 and 2014 national championship teams for football, 2 Final Four appearances, including a 2007 national championship game appearance in basketball. I mean, you've had the opportunity to really experience some great moments behind the mic for the Buckeyes.
And it's hard to really pare it down to just a few. My first year in 1998, there was a third Final Four that has since been vacated that they were able to go to when Jim O'Brien was the coach, Scooney Penn's first year playing, and a team that had lost 20 games the previous year. Also that season in football, they were preseason number 1. And had it not been for a late season loss to Michigan State, they probably would have had a chance to play for the first BCS national championship. But then, as you said, Billy, the 2 national championships they won in football in 2002, one that really kind of came out of nowhere. Then in 2014, some other appearances in a national championship game like this past year. And then in basketball, the 2 Final Fours that they went to under Thad Matta, but also seeing just some outstanding athletes perform on the field, getting to know some of them, getting to work with some of the coaches that have come through here, with some of them even developing a little bit of a personal relationship with, which is always a challenge sometimes with coaches. But again, it comes down to the people too, the people at the sports information office at Ohio State that we've dealt with, the assistant coaches, the doctors, the trainers, and the people in our radio group that I get a chance to work with on a daily basis. So there's a lot of great memories, most of it involving some of those fantastic people.
And I have to ask, because you've had a chance to see so many different people at Ohio State, I was wondering if you might be able to give me a personal story or maybe just a moment on the field that you remember covering some of these people. Obviously, you worked for a long time with one of the most legendary coaches in the history of college football, Urban Meyer. Do you have a great personal story? I mean, because you had an opportunity to really get to see him in more personal settings that a lot of people in the national media don't have a chance to see.
Well, really, we didn't. Urban was doing the media obligations that were required through our network and rights holders. It was a challenge with Urban. It wasn't something that he enjoyed doing, and he made that very clear. It wasn't a personal matter, but he really didn't like doing it, and it became a challenge at times. However, when he did do it, he was very forthcoming. Probably, maybe the most memorable thing I can tell you was a story that he relayed the week of the Ohio State-Michigan game, and it went back to when he was a graduate assistant at Ohio State under Earl Bruce. He told the story about being in the locker room in Michigan Stadium, the visiting locker room, and being in the front of the locker room by the door that leads out to the tunnel. And as the team's getting ready to go out, he's standing there. And the next thing you know, all of the Michigan players and their coaches come barreling out. And Bo Schembechler is standing right there. And he told the story that it was like, who am I to be here doing all of this? So that's probably the one story that comes to mind really during his time there that jumps into my mind.
What stands out to you about Ezekiel Elliott and his time at Ohio State?
But the thing that stands out is that when he first got there, he was the number 2 running back behind Carlos Hyde and was just kind of being spoon-fed a little bit of his opportunities. And then in that 2014 season, and at the start of the season, he was dealing with a little bit of a hand injury. So it was a slow start. But the thing you think about is the 3-game postseason run that he had. And if you remember, Billy, Ohio State was without their starting quarterback, J.T. Barrett, who had replaced the incoming starting quarterback to start the year, Braxton Miller, who was hurt before the season opener. They really relied heavily on Elliott, and he had 3 postseason games that were just fantastic when you consider Wisconsin, Alabama, and Oregon in winning a national championship. That's probably the first thing you think about when you think of Elliott.
And I'll pair these two together because they're brothers. But how about the Bosa brothers? They were very successful at Ohio State and seem to be having good careers in the NFL as well.
Yeah, incredible talent and just amazing how they could change a game from their defensive end position. And those guys would probably be the first to tell you too that, they benefited from great coaching from Larry Johnson, the defensive line coach, but also benefited from good talent around them on those defensive lines. And really what Ohio State has done going all the way back to John Cooper's time was they tried to have a solid rotation of people. So it wasn't just 4 down linemen playing all the time, but those guys were incredible game changers. When you think about Joey Bosa had a walk-off sack in overtime at Penn State to win a football game. Nick, we really didn't get to see a lot of Nick. Unfortunately, his career at Ohio State ended because of injury and his time was compressed, but you could tell he was an outstanding football player. And, there was a little bit of a connection by the fact that, they had an uncle that played in Ohio State in the 80s, Eric Kumaro. So there was a little bit of a legacy there, even though their father, who had played in the NFL, played at Boston College. But yeah, 2 incredibly dominant and game-changing defensive linemen.
What about that, Matta? He's a guy you got to work with as well, had success as the Ohio State basketball coach, and just recently decided to go to Indiana as well to work in administration there.
Well, Thad Matta is a personal favorite of mine, and he's kind of the exception. In most cases, when you're announcers, you have to be careful about forming personal relationships with players and coaches that you cover because, sometimes you may have to say some things or report on some things that aren't the most complimentary. But Thad was the exception. Over the course of his 13 years, we developed a good friendship that has continued now. And, I've stayed in touch with Thad and his wife. They're just wonderful, wonderful people. It's unfortunate that things ended at Ohio State the way that they did. But, I think you can look back too and see that Thad Matta did things the right way. That's why he's the all-time winningest coach of the school. That's why his name's hanging on a banner in the rafters. Just a guy that I consider an outstanding friend, but a wonderful coach. And, when his time came to an end, it was amazing to see all of his former players that came from all over, not only the country, but from different corners of the world where they were playing professionally that came to have like a farewell for him in Columbus. And great to see that he's back in college basketball. And it's going to be interesting to see what his capacity will involve. But, traded brief text with him the other day, and he's excited about it.
That's great to hear. And Paul, hopefully you don't mind me asking this question because I know the game is still relatively fresh in the last few weeks, but you've had the opportunity to call some great moments and also, unfortunately, some tough moments like a couple weeks ago with that Oral Roberts game. As an announcer, how do you process a moment like that and really communicate that to the fans in the aftermath of that game?
Well, the first thing you try to do, Billy, is just think about doing what you're supposed to do with broadcasting a game and describing what's going on. And, Oral Roberts was a team that coming into that game, people knew they could be a dangerous ball club given what they had done and two incredible players in Max Asmus and Kevin O'Bander. Uh, Ohio State did not play a very good game. Even despite that, they still had a chance to possibly win that basketball game and didn't. You learn that you don't live and die with wins and defeats. Certainly, when there's great achievements by the teams that you broadcast games for, it does add to the excitement. That one really stung, but I think it did because this was a basketball team that had been through so much, like everybody, going through a season where the virus created such limitations. To see a team that they had lost 4 in a row to end the regular season, but when you look at who they played, it was kind of a murderer's row when you throw in Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan in that game, got their swagger back in the Big Ten tournament, but then had it just come crashing to a halt with that game. And, that was one that really kind of hit you. But, like you said, Billy, you process it, you move on, and you look back and you think, what an exciting season.
How do you describe the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry? I mean, this is a legendary rivalry in sports. Two great stadiums, great fan bases, so many great memories. As the Ohio State announcer, how do you describe what it's like to play the Wolverines?
Well, it does kind of have a life of its own. And Billy, the great thing now that we've had conference adjustments, divisions, and all of that, it's great that the rivalry has still been left on the final Saturday of the regular season. Probably to get the best example of it is when you hear former players who've played in that. And I spent time working in Detroit, and during the time I was there, I worked for one of the 5 stations that broadcast games for the University of Michigan. So I got to experience it from that side as well. But hearing guys that played in the game, they talk about it. It's the most physical game that they've ever played in. Some of them who've even played at the professional level say it's more physical than any games they've played in the NFL. There's a great respect for your rival in that game. You want to beat them more than you want to beat anybody else. I grew up in the time of the 10-year war, thinking about Woody Hayes and Bo Schembechler, and the times when the winner of that game was going to win the Big Ten, and for a while was the only team from the Big Ten that was going to go to a bowl game. So it does kind of have a life all of its own. Great games, great finishes, great disappointments, great successes, but it's something that still is a great part of the history of Ohio State football and Michigan. And it was unfortunate that the game couldn't be played this year.
I'm curious, Paul, how do you prep for a game? I mean, let's just say you've got Ohio State, Michigan on a Saturday. What are you doing the days leading up to the game, the week leading up to the game to prepare for that game? How does it differ for basketball? And kind of a part 2 to that question, is your prep process any different for a March Madness tournament game than it is for a regular season game or a bowl game and a regular season football game?
Well, Billy, from the beginning of what you asked, the Michigan game, part of the challenge is during the month of November, you have the overlap with basketball. And that makes it kind of crazy. Oftentimes there's at least 1, sometimes 2 games during that week leading up to it. But it's a matter of organizing yourself. And the preparation for each football game and each basketball game, at least the approach I take, it's the same for all. You don't do any more for an NCAA tournament game, for a bowl game, or for the Ohio State-Michigan game than you do for any other, because you don't want the listeners to have any inclination based on what you're doing that any game is less important. So it's the prep is the same. It's a lot of reading of things. It's, DVR now has been great because you can get video of the upcoming opponent. Once you put your game chart together, you can then watch some of that with your game chart to get familiar with names and numbers and tendencies and things like that. The biggest part of it is the prep time. It's organizing the stats in the way you want to do it, organizing your game chart, and everybody does game charts differently. But just being I try to tell people, it's comparable to studying for a test in school. You study as much as you can. You study for any possible thing that you may come across, knowing that once the game gets there, a lot of what you've prepared, you may not even use, but just being as prepared as you possibly can. But yeah, to the last part of your question, no different for an NCAA tournament. The only difference maybe in that regard is that it's a team that you've not had a chance to see on TV before, like an Oral Roberts. And trying to find video of them just to get familiar with their players and seeing them on the move. Once you get into conference season in basketball, you've seen those opponents sometimes once, sometimes twice with a conference tournament. That helps the familiarity. The Big Ten Network helps with conference opponents because you can see so many of their games. But the preparation is the biggest part of it. Yeah, and you hope that when you get to whenever they're ready to kick off or they're ready to tip off, you feel as though you prepared as much as you can, knowing that in some ways you probably still wish that you had done more.
I was curious, what are some of your favorite stadiums to go and broadcast from around the country? I mean, you have a great opportunity to travel in the Big Ten, and you've had a great opportunity to go to some out-of-conference stadiums as well. What are some that stand to mind? Also, I'm curious, as a Virginia Tech student, where did Lane Stadium rank when you visited in 2015?
Well, I'll start with the Big Ten stadiums, and people ask that question often, especially Ohio State fans that want to contemplate making trips to road games. And the first place I tell them that I always suggest is to go to Camp Randall Stadium in Madison, Wisconsin, but go to a day game. Don't go to a night game. Night games, it's a little bit of, and I mean this in a good way, it's a little bit of a zoo. But just a great setting, a great older stadium that they've modified in many ways, great fan support. So Camp Randall Stadium is probably my favorite in the Big Ten to recommend to people to go. Outside of the conference, one of the ones I've had a chance to see a couple of three times now is Husky Stadium in Seattle, Washington. And what makes that so unique is the open end of the stadium faces out to Lake Washington, and people come up on their boats and park their boats and go to the games there. It's really, truly an exciting stadium to be at. And Lane Stadium, I've had a chance to be there a handful of times during the times that I broadcast games for the University of Cincinnati, back when they and Virginia Tech were both in the Metro Conference, but independents in football, they would play one another semi-regularly. And I've been at Lane Stadium when it's been good weather, when it's been sloppy weather. We were there with the Bearcats one year where Cincinnati pulled off a big, surprising win. And their head coach, Rick Minner at the time, he grabbed a bucket full of mud outside the locker room and smeared it all over himself to get his team all fired up, said, let's go roll around in the mud and take this game away. So Lane Stadium, and the last time we were there when Ohio State played, it was the season opening game, a night game, kind of a lot of excitement coming off the heels of Virginia Tech winning in Columbus the year before. And that was really an exciting atmosphere for that game.
I'm curious, Paul, because I'm sure you get this question too. Do you think college football has a parity problem? I mean, as the Ohio State announcer, you're kind of in the group that has kind of been the beneficiary, the cream of the crop during this college football playoff era. I mean, people say, well, Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, they've really been the main players in this college football playoff. Other schools haven't really been able to break in to that group, with the exception of a year or two here and there. I mean, do you understand that, or are you of the mindset, look, this is the way the game is. Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama are going to continue to recruit the best players. It's up to the other schools to eventually be able to recruit better than them and knock them off.
Well, I think there is a little bit of a two-tiered system that in some ways is unfair to the group of five schools. When you talk about schools in the Big Ten or the ACC or the Pac-12 or the SEC, there are the haves and the have-nots, but, certainly things are set up that say the lower finishing teams in the standings in those conferences at least have the opportunity to get to their conference championship games, and or they have the opportunity to play a Clemson, to play an Ohio State, to play an Alabama, and pull off a big upset. The group of five teams, it's really a challenge. Excuse me, let me send that phone call to voicemail. They have a hard time getting some of those games scheduled to be able to pull off those upsets to help their strength of schedule. And then often when they are able to do some of the things they did, like, Cincinnati was a good example this past year. Boise State has been an example in previous years. Whether it was the BCS or now the bowl New Year's Day 6, even if they run the table, even if they finish undefeated and do everything they can do, there still seems to be a bias against giving them an opportunity to play for a national championship. And some of that you understand, some of it you don't. Here in the state of Ohio, not only with, excuse me, the University of Cincinnati, but the Mid-American Conference, when you've got schools that have had great seasons in the past, whether it's Miami, Ohio, whether it's Bowling Green, whomever, Toledo, the system just isn't set up for them to be, unfortunately, to be able to get a chance, maybe, yes, to play in a New Year's Six game, but not to play for a national championship. And that's where I think there's a parity issue, if that's the right way to word it, Billy.
I'm curious, Paul, because you are a native of the state of Ohio. Where does Ohio State and their fan base rank in terms of the whole picture of Ohio sports? I mean, I know you've got a lot of Cleveland Browns fans, big Cleveland sports fans. Everyone talks about all the pain and misery they've gone through for so many years. So where does Ohio State rank in terms of fandom when you compare them to the professional teams?
Well, that's a discussion that always comes up, and especially being from Cincinnati, it's a little diluted in the southwest part of the state, but that's because you have the University of Cincinnati, you've got Miami, Ohio, and you have the influence from the Kentucky schools that comes across the river. But across the state, Ohio State is big, and I think that's why you've seen at times now the Mid-American Conference in November playing so many of their games on weeknights. I think that certainly with the Browns and the Bengals taking care of drawing the attention on Sundays, with the influence of Major League Baseball, with an NBA team in Cleveland, an NHL team here in Columbus, college football has its own special place on Saturdays, and Ohio State is able to really dominate that. I think you see, especially in the corners of the state that are away from the major markets. We used to have an opportunity to travel around the state during the week during football season to do kind of a traveling show. And we would get such big turnouts and such big support from the smaller towns in Ohio as opposed to the major cities, just because they may have whatever affiliation they have for a pro team, but Ohio State, with that name, the state of Ohio on there, it a lot of sports fans, it makes them feel across the state like it's their team, as opposed to the Browns being Northern Ohio's team, the Bengals being Southern Ohio's team.
Paul, you've been so gracious with your time. I have two final questions for you. My first one is, what's your advice to aspiring sportscasters trying to make it during this pandemic? I mean, you know better than anyone, it's already a competitive business, and now we have to deal with the realities of this current pandemic. So what's your advice to young guys and girls like me who want to get in the field of sportscasting?
Well, and I don't know what it's like to try and do it in a time like this in the pandemic. So I'll try, Billy, to kind of couch it how I would normally answer that question. And it's take advantage of every opportunity that you can, whether you're involved in a student station at Virginia Tech or any other college, or even at high schools that now do some of that stuff. If it's an opportunity to get out and broadcast a game for a student station, whether it's football, basketball, any of the other sports, take advantage of doing that. And take advantage of repeatedly doing it, because one of the things that helps you when it comes to game announcing, and that is just getting repetitions of work, getting used to doing games, getting used to the different situations, also getting used to preparing and learning what you have to do to prepare for games. Doing all of the work with your student station that you're able to do outside of doing game broadcast, and not limiting it to sports either. I got started in my career working as a news reporter, and at a couple of different times I've had to go back to working as a newscaster. So being flexible with what it is that you have the opportunity to do, but also, listen to everybody that's done it, listen to their story, because every story is different. Everybody gets started in a different way. Not everybody's path goes the same way. So many people, maybe they've gone to college and they've majored in a different field and they find themselves in broadcasting, and vice versa happens too. So, take what you can from everybody's path and then try and figure out as you can the best way to do it. But most importantly, it's also the networking with people, the acquaintances you make, the people you come in contact with, the people you stay in touch with and follow up on, because oftentimes when job opportunities come about, you're notified because of the people not necessarily because the jobs are open or they're posted or you're made aware of them that way. It's through a reference, through a recommendation from somebody you've made contact with. So, being able to establish a network of acquaintances, not only is it a good thing just from a personal and a sociable standpoint, but you never know when somebody that you've worked with or you've been in contact with may think of you when there's an opportunity that needs to be filled.
Paul, my final question for you is, as you reflect on your career, are you pretty content with how it's played out? I mean, you've been at Ohio State for over 20 years. You've called national championships, Final Four appearances. You've made a couple of other great stops in your career, met so many incredible people. I mean, as you reflect on your career, pretty happy with how it's played out? Is there something you wish you could have done? Or all being said, pretty content to be at Ohio State for the past 20 plus years?
Very content, and not just working in Columbus and broadcasting Ohio State games, but all of the other things I've done. I've had the opportunity, to live in a few different places and find out what it's like to move and have to adjust to new cities, but then come back to a state and surrounding areas that I'm comfortable with. Made some great relationships with some wonderful people, been able to see some outstanding teams, been able to see some difficult teams that have struggled through challenges. When I first started doing games for the University of Cincinnati, they were probably the worst team in 1A football. So seen some things like that. But really, Billy, when I think about it, and, as I'm in my early 60s now and looking on the back end of a career, I think about, being able to make the most out of the opportunities that were there and not think about the things that didn't occur. There were some other opportunities that I pursued, some things that I, was in the running for that didn't happen. I had a couple of opportunities to interview for Major League Baseball jobs. Didn't happen. That's fine. Wasn't focused on what didn't happen. It was focusing on what you were doing at the time. There's so many people that think about what's the next career move. And that's understandable, but you don't want to lose sight of putting every effort in to the job you have and the responsibility you have at that point in time to do that the best you can. Even if it's something that you're not thrilled about, it still has to show to a potential employer or current employers for that matter, that you're putting everything in to what you're doing at that time. So it's been a wonderful ride. I hope to continue it for as long as possible. Again, maybe the most exciting thing is some of the people that I've had a chance to meet, to work with, to get to know, to call friends. And, that's maybe the most exciting part about it all.
Paul, this has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you about your great career, all the insights and stories you've had, all the people you've met. Thank you so much for your time today. It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Billy, and all the best to you.
For sure. That's Paul Keels, the longtime voice of the Ohio State Buckeyes. Nice enough to join me today on the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. Thanks to everybody for joining us. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. We'll see you next time.